Welcome to the webinar. I'm Jeff Webster. I'm Director of Research at Trellis. I'm joined by Brian Ashton, our Vice President for Community Investment, and also Casey Klepper, our Research Analyst, who's also the project lead and first author of the report. We'll be talking about the Student Financial Wellness Survey from our Spring 2018 survey, and we're real excited to share what we learned from that survey. Want to remind people that if you have questions, please type them into the chat box, and we'll address those questions at the end of the presentation. But you can type that throughout the presentation. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the study. This study arose from our growing awareness of the interplay between student finances and student academic success. Our previous research suggested low levels of student knowledge about our system of financing higher education, and especially as it relates to student loans. With the survey, we wanted to look at multiple facets of student financial wellness, including financial literacy, attitudes towards debt, perceptions of affordability, and also students' basic needs. We wanted to provide participating schools with this information so they can learn, so they can align their initiatives with a firm understanding of where their students are financially. Already, we've shared the results with the participating 12 schools, and it's already being used to inform their money management courses, their loan counseling efforts, text nudges regarding debt, and even some of their mental health initiatives. We will be presenting today the results from our spring survey. We're also recruiting for the fall of 2018. There's slots available. Our intent is to make this an annual survey, and it'll be administered in the fall each year. The intent of this is to begin conversations on campus and to provide students, provide administrators with evidence on the status of the financial well-being of their students. We will, shortly after the webinar, we will send each of you some information about how to participate if you have interest in that. It is a free survey. We follow the data protocols as prescribed in your institutional review board's directives. So Liz, talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So we'll initially talk about the research topics in the survey, and I'll also talk a little bit about the methodology. I'll hand it off to Casey, who will cover the findings. And at the end of each of the 4 sections of these findings, Brian will offer a little bit of perspective from, okay, we have this information about the students, how can we apply this at a campus level? What are some of the discussions that these results can drive? And then Brian will talk a little bit about the future plans for our research with the survey. And at the end, we'll cover questions, your questions in the chat box. So there's a lot of excellent student surveys out there. We wanted ours to cover an array of financial topics. So we wanted to cover financial knowledge. We wanted to cover financial knowledge, especially the concept of interest for obvious purposes. We wanted to talk about the financial challenges, stress, and behaviors. We wanted to also cover attitudes about student debt, especially their sense of the odds of repaying their loans. We also covered some of the students' academic goals, paying for college, and especially how that relates to college affordability. Also, it's important to cover topics related to food, housing, and transportation insecurity, and because we know that this can derail students from reaching their academic potential. We also cover perceptions of institutional support. So do the students actually feel supported by their institutions? So to cover these topics effectively, We worked hard to ensure that the survey flowed well, that the students understood the questions, and they were motivated to finish. So here's a look at our methodology. So we launched the survey in February 12th, 2018. We did email invitations to students and provided reminders throughout the survey period. We surveyed over 53,000 students. We had a good response rate of 11%, but an excellent completion rate of 88%. So this, and the median time spent was about 13 minutes to complete the survey. So we felt like we achieved our goal of having the questions flow well and that the topics were relevant to the students, so they were motivated to complete the instrument. We had 12 schools participate from 3 school sectors and 3 different states. So the people who responded to the survey differed a little bit from the survey population in general. So our responders tended to be more likely to be full-time students. They were more likely to be female, and they were a tad bit older than the survey population in general. With the survey, we wanted to rely on standard scales where possible. So we wanted to look at financial. Right, I'm sorry. So we wanted to cover standard scales to measure financial literacy, customer satisfaction, debt aversion, food security, and housing security. Generally, we use the short versions of these scales to avoid cognitive fatigue. For the financial knowledge, we use the Lasardi-Mitchell 3-question scale. For customer satisfaction, the Net Promoter Scale. Debt aversion, we borrowed from Angela Boatman and Brett Evans at Vanderbilt. We use the USDA 6-question food security scale. And for housing security, we relied on the HOPE lab, although we based it on the 12-month period. So, Casey, what did we learn from this?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So the first topic area I want to talk about is student financial security. So the survey includes lots of questions on different topics. We wanted it to be a broad, usable survey. So this first set are things like affordability of college, access to emergency funds, topics like running out of money. And we think that financial wellness issues have always been common, and it's something that we're starting to understand more about and starting to understand the connection between academic success and these financial wellness issues. And besides the emotional toll that financial insecurity can have, I think it's safe to say that anyone that is working on narrow margins in their finances are very vulnerable to academic disruptions. So one of the first questions we asked students is, do I worry about being able to pay my current monthly expenses? And we found that almost half of respondents either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, that they worry about paying their current monthly expenses. We also asked students whether they worry about having enough money to pay for school. This is one of a couple of key metrics that we tied other questions in our survey to and looked at how they relate with each other, these questions about paying for college or worrying about paying for next semester. We found that almost 2 in 3 respondents, 64%, agreed or strongly agreed that they worry about having enough money to pay for school. Like I said, we also asked about whether students know how they'll pay for college next semester. And this one is pretty concerning. More than a quarter of respondents in our survey, 27%, disagreed or strongly disagreed that they knew how they would pay for college next semester. So even more than the previous question of worrying about paying for college in general, this one is very specific to the next semester. We look at responses to questions in the future on, or that we'll discuss later about food insecurity, housing insecurity, and we tie it to questions like this of how, whether students know how they'll pay for college in the next semester. Another concerning finding is just the access to $500 in a cash or credit in case a student has an unexpected need in the next month. This is something that is also a problem with the American population at large, but college students are particularly vulnerable to these unexpected emergency expenses. So more than half of respondents, 57%, indicated that they would have trouble getting this $500 in cash or credit if they needed it. When we looked at responses to this question, we found that students who reported that they have trouble getting $500 cash or credit tended to respond at higher rates that they worry about paying for enough money for school, and they respond at lower rates that they know how they'll pay for college next semester. So this kind of points to some key student success initiatives that Brian may address here in a second, but this access to $500 does seem to be tied to a more larger concern about paying for college. Female respondents also tended to respond at higher rates than males, that they would have trouble meeting a $500 emergency. There could be multiple reasons for this. Research points to, of course, women leading single-family households at higher rates, but also points to, in surveys, research that males tend to be overconfident in their analysis of their own finances. We asked students in the past year, how many times did you run out of money? More than 2/3, 70% of respondents reported running out of money at least once in the last 12 months. Almost half, 46%, reported running out of money 3 or more times. Perhaps most alarmingly, 25% of respondents reported running out of money 5 or more times in the past year. And these students tended to respond at higher rates that they worry about having enough money to pay for school, and at lower rates that they know how they'll pay for college next semester. We also wanted to ask questions about family and supporting family while in school, because we know that it can be a challenge to work, go to school, and support family. We found that more than a third, 38%, either agreed or strongly agreed that it is important that they support their family financially while they're in college. Students who reported that it's important to them that they support their family financially tended to be, at higher rates, tended to be part-time students and over 25 years of age. Perhaps not a very surprising finding, but it is something that we found that older students and part-time students seem to support family at higher rates. So when we asked them a series of questions about whether students provide financial support for individuals, we found that 15% indicated that they support a child or children while attending school. 18% of respondents reported providing financial support for their parents or guardians while in school, and 9% supported family members other than parents, children, and spouses. This highlights just perhaps an untalked about phenomenon where students are providing money back to parents. So it really brings into question for us all to think about the policy implications of expected family contribution and if a family is actually maybe losing some income when a student goes to school, and how can we better support that student, and how can we better inform the family and the student about college and paying for college.
Thank you, Casey. As we mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that we're very excited about with this instrument is the ability to inform practice, not just at a broader national level, but also on the campuses that administer the instrument. And so some of the findings that we've seen here around student financial security, I think, have pretty clear ties to individual campus-based policies and procedures. And I want to talk through a few of those that we've seen at a national level, as well as some things that we've seen movement on from the campuses that have already administered the survey in the spring of 2018. I think the first thing that this really highlights is the need to begin conversations about the design and delivery of various financial aid programs. And so as we think about this, like Casey alluded to a lot of the challenges that our students are facing regarding running out of cash or not being able to come up with a certain dollar amount in the event of an emergency, which we know may not be different than a broader portion of the United States population, but the fragility that goes with the student population can lead to some unintended consequences potentially beyond just that initial emergency or incident that pops up. And we really see that then taking hold as it relates to student retention and the ability to stay enrolled in school. And so I think what we've seen here, and we've seen this conversation advance nationally, is the desire to move in the direction of looking at more of reactive emergency-based aid programs on college campuses, and beginning to think about how we can help students to navigate some of those small dollar challenges that they may experience. We've seen some campuses really take hold of this conversation after getting a hold of the report, looking at everything from redirecting resources into emergency aid programs to helping students to set up emergency savings programs. And those, I think, are both ways that we can really work to begin that conversation around how we help students to plan as much as they potentially can for the unexpected. Casey also alluded to the larger number of individuals that are supporting dependents, whether that be children or parents. And as we think about institutional and other academic aid and cost of attendance in particular, those metrics are normally driven by just the individual and the educational expenses, but the living expenses for those that are dependent on them don't stop when that student goes to college. And as we think about design of financial aid programs, but also financial support programs, I think we really need to begin to have that conversation about how we broaden the lens of which we view those programs and think about the broader family unit in those conversations. And we've seen some campuses that have really begun to embrace the idea of doing some multi-generational outreach in terms of their support services, but also in terms of the financial aid packaging that they may do. Additionally, I think one of the things that these results show is that we as institutions have an obligation to provide students with the support to financially plan for the degree. So I would imagine that most institutions that are on this webinar have some form of academic plan for degree that their students go through, normally in a first-year seminar course or sometimes at orientation. Rarely do we see that academic plan for degree being supplemented with a financial plan for degree. As we have those conversations, I think it's important for us to identify and begin to think through where unmet need gaps may arise and where that may present challenges to students in financing their degree over the course of the degree term, whether that be 4 semesters, 8 semesters, or longer. As we think about that, I think some of the data that we see anecdotally on campus is that students increasingly are citing finances as the leading cause for why they do not return to school. And we can argue about chicken or egg scenario of does the academic issue come first or the financial issue come first. But the numbers that we're seeing both in the study as well as in our campus level data are large enough to say that finances play a very large part in why students do not return to campus. And so the need to think through that financial plan for a degree on the front end can significantly reduce the burden and help us to think about how we proactively address those gaps earlier in the process as opposed to what tends to happen, which is a few weeks before the start of the semester when we're trying to close those gaps with the financial aid office. Finally, I think that there's an opportunity for our campuses to really evaluate the messaging related to student refunds and work to support students in managing the cash flow challenges that they may have. And so, very often we provide students with a lump sum of money on the front end for those who are in particular may not be living on campus and have as large of an institutional obligation as their Title IV aid may cover. When we think about those students, that cash flow over the course of a semester is a difficult concept for many of them to grasp. And as we think through that sort of injection of cash into their life, given where they are from a financial fragility side, there may be a desire to use that quickly to cover some challenges that they may have. As that happens, one of the things that we want to make sure is that they are still in a process where they're able to plan and that we don't subject themselves to larger emergencies on the back end because of some of those decisions on the front end. And so really working with programs like financial coaching initiatives to help to students to manage those cash flow components of their life can have a strong impact. The final thing that I would add here is that all of this sort of gets back to the idea of thinking through financial models in terms of more of a predictive analytics mindset, to think through what students are most at risk for financial dropout because of their lack of financial security. And I think many of our offices have the data, especially in the financial aid and student account side, to have those conversations. There is certainly some guidance that we need at the federal level to help us to unlock some of that data and to have more robust conversations. But the more that we can do to utilize that data to proactively address students who may be financially fragile, the more we'll be able to have an impact on retention and try to close some of those financial gaps moving forward.
Thanks, Brian. So the next set of responses to the survey I'd like to talk about is around basic needs security. So there's been a growing awareness and certainly a growing body of research around basic needs security. Things like food, safe shelter, transportation, healthcare. And we thought we really believe it's important for schools to have access to a look at the basic needs security of their students. We use the USDA food security scale. We use a 6-question scale instead of the 12-question because we wanted to keep cognitive load of the survey down because of all the topics that we want to address in the survey. We asked over a 12-month scale. We wanted to do that so that we could kind of get a look at a longer view of what kind of food insecurity students may be facing, but also we chose to implement the survey at a time in fall first for methodological reasons where financial aid had hit, but not long enough where that financial aid may have run out. So because of that, a 30-day scale may have looked more into the summer instead of a full year, which we're trying to do. Because of that, when we're interpreting this data, we're really concentrating on very low food security. Low food security on the USDA scale is 1 to 2 of the 6 questions counts as low food security. Very low food security, they're indicating 4, 5, or 5 or 6 of these questions in the affirmative. And so that's what we're really concentrating on here. And what we found is 36% of our respondents showed signs of very low food security. Very low food security is reports of multiple indications of disrupted eating patterns and reduced food intake. If you want to see the exact questions in the scale, please refer to our report in the appendix. There's all sorts of methodological information about our scales. What we did find when looking at how respondents with very low food security answered other questions in the survey, we find that students with very low food security tended to respond at higher rates that they would have trouble getting $500 in cash or credit in case of emergency. We also found that those students tended to worry more about having enough money to pay for school. They also responded at lower rates that they knew how they would pay for college next semester. We also found that respondents with very low food security tended to use public food assistance at higher rates. We kind of use public food assistance as one metric to look at poverty issues. And so those did hang together. Students that are struggling with food security were more likely to use public food assistance. Also, our respondents in our survey that had a history in foster care or as a dependent of the court were also associated with higher rates of very low food security. So we looked at housing security and homelessness as well. We based these scales off of the good work that the Hope Lab and other leading research in this field have defined. They define a homeless person as a person without a place to live, often residing in a shelter, an automobile, an abandoned building, or outside. Housing insecurity is defined as broader sets of challenges such as the inability to pay rent or utilities or the need to move frequently. So students are counted as housing insecure if they answered yes to any of the 5 questions in the housing insecurity scale. We found that 40% of respondents in our survey showed signs of being housing insecure, and 4% showed indicated homelessness within the prior 12 months. We also found that respondents who were housing insecure and or homeless tended to answer at higher rates that they would have trouble getting $500 in patient emergency. We also looked at housing insecurity and homelessness and ran those questions on against some of the other key responses. So people with housing insecurity and or homelessness, they also tended to respond at higher rates that they worry about having enough money to pay for school, and at lower rates that they know how they would pay for college next semester. These findings just kind of drive home that these basic needs security are not unrelated to academic success, or in this case, thinking about how to pay for college or worrying about paying for college. They're very much connected. Respondents who were housing insecure and or homeless were also associated with higher rates of being part-time students. They tended to be over 25 years of age at greater rates. And once again, having been in foster care or a dependent of the court was associated with higher rates of being housing insecure and or homeless. Brian, you want to talk about some implications?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've seen, as Casey mentioned, we've seen a rise in understanding that basic needs are something that as college administrators we need to pay more attention to. And I think, as we think through some of the high impact practices that have traditionally been tied to retention, a lot of those are predicated on the idea that from a hierarchy of needs side that students' basic needs are met. And if we're unable to meet those basic needs, then a lot of those high impact practices related to retention and academic success probably don't carry the same weight as they would if those students were, again, secure in food and housing in particular. As we think about this, we've seen a lot of innovative approaches that have begun to take hold on campuses to address some of these challenges. We've really seen a lot of good work centered around connecting students to resources, and in particular, community resources that may be available, including SNAP and EBT type programs. We've seen this take hold in programs like the ASAP program at the City University of New York. We've seen Cuyahoga Community College in the Cleveland, Ohio area do a lot of work on these topics. Again, to have that holistic one-stop center to help provide students with not only financial coaching and support, but also the access to public benefits that they may need. Here in our backyard in San Antonio, we've seen good work with Project Quest at the Alamo Community College Center. And we've also seen really good work at the Share Center in the Alamo Community College District at Palo Alto College, which works to provide emergency support services such as food pantries and emergency funding to students, in addition to some of the financial literacy and financial coaching services that may help them to be better on the back end of the emergency that they may be facing. As we think about this, we also want to look at ways that campuses can begin to provide and address temporary housing situations. We've seen innovative practices here in terms of partnering with neighboring real estate developers to offer a certain percentage of housing units, either as affordable housing units and or as short-term leases that the institution can rent out to begin to provide that student with a 2 to 4 week transitional or bridge housing situation. We've also seen that same type of support service take hold in residence halls, where there may be some swing beds that are available for students that go through a temporary housing crisis as well. I think that it's increasingly important for campuses to begin to work across not only their campus resources, but also the community resources that they may have in the area. And so when we think about the traditional town to gown relationship, it tends to be driven by community relations and making sure that the university or college is a good partner in the community. Increasingly, we're seeing that there's a need for some of the support services that are available at the community level to be linked into the college and university setting as well. And so to the extent that those relationships can be formed, we see good practice in that for the local supportive students. That also ties into the need to help to develop crisis support teams. These are more common on the mental health side, where many campuses will engage with a mental health support task force. But we're also seeing these task forces rise for crisis support, where units across the campus that may work with students who are in distress come together to talk through how to holistically case manage that student, And these could be issues related to basic needs. They could be related to mental health. They could be related to some academic support as well. But the idea is to provide cross-functional support to that student in a uniform plan for care. It's also important to get back to the town and gown issue to integrate some of the community-based resources into those conversations, again, to make sure that that student receives the most holistic care that they can. Finally, I think one of the other things that we've seen that has been a best practice for our campuses is to work to train and educate not only campus administrators, but also faculty members on some of the realities that students face. And so a lot of the data that we're presenting here today in the webinar can be utilized to help faculty members on your campus in particular understand what the new reality of a college student may look like. And part of the reason for this is that our faculty are very often our first line of defense as it relates to working with students. They're the ones who may see a student missing class 3 to 5 times in a course of a few weeks, or may see a student that falls asleep in class or is coming to class and looking in a way of that may indicate that there's some basic needs security issues that are presenting. We don't want those faculty members necessarily to be prepared to completely intervene with those students, but we do want them to be aware of the reality of what our students may be facing on campus, and then help to have awareness of the support services that are available to help those students to navigate those challenges.
Thanks, Brian. So the next section of questions we want to talk about is around paying for college and student debt. So paying for college is often a web of variety of sources: federal, state, institutional, private grants, current employment, family support, savings, various loan products. So we wanted to look at how students are paying for college on one hand, then we wanted to look at student debt, their attitudes, their confidence, and we think that this can really provide schools some good information around how students are funding their education. The first question I want to talk about is, I have more student loan debt than I expected to at this point. So majority of respondents, 60% who borrowed, either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that they had more student loan debt than they expected at this point. That includes 29% who strongly agreed that they had more student loan debt at this point. We asked students, how confident are you that you will be able to pay off the debt acquired while you were a student? So more than 2/3 of respondents who reported having a student loan were either not at all confident or only somewhat confident that they would be able to pay off that debt while they were a student. Particularly concerning is the 28% who are not at all confident that they will be able to pay off the debt acquired while they were a student. We used an augmented financial knowledge scale, a Lusardi scale, and these questions you can find in the appendices of the report. We picked the ones that are more focused on education and loans and time value of money and interest. When we asked those 3 questions, we found that 28% only 28% answered all 3 questions correctly. But we did find that a good range of students answered at least one correctly. We also asked students about borrowing, in particular risky borrowing. We asked about credit card use, payday loan use, and auto title use. The credit card debt is much more common. 41% of our respondents said that they had borrowed a credit card in the last 12 months. We also asked about whether students paid for college using a credit card, and that was 28% of respondents. We found that 5% of respondents had used a payday loan in the last 12 months, and 4% had used an auto title loan. All 3 of these sources are risky borrowing with higher interest rates, but in particular payday loans and auto title loans are concerning borrowing habits. We dug into that a little bit. So of those who said that they borrowed a payday loan in the last 12 months, About 27% did it 2 or more times. 44% did it 1 time, and very concerning. 10% borrowed. 10% of the respondents who had borrowed a payday loan did so 5 or more times in a year, which indicates a debt cycle, a cycle where you're paying off the debt, but you still need to borrow another risky loan in order to keep going. Looking at auto title loans, we're a little different. Most auto title loans were only borrowed once or twice in the past year. Ryan, you have some thoughts on
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think what we've seen here is the need for campuses to really engage with services related to student financial literacy and to help students to understand some of the obligations that they may be entering into. And so as we think through this, there's a couple different touch points that campuses have throughout the life cycle. The first is really when the student comes in and helping to inform them about their borrowing decisions and thinking through what information we provide on the front end as part of award letters, entrance counseling, and then ultimately some of that financial planning for degree conversations that we talked about earlier. Beyond that, there's need for ongoing supported services in the financial literacy space. And so we talk a lot about providing just-in-time education to our students, making sure that we're providing the appropriate information at the time of decision-making. And that's an ongoing cycle throughout the student's time while they're enrolled. This can include things like notifications, such as debt letters and other things, or it can get more into some of the behavioral economics and some of the nudge-based decisions in terms of trying to get students to appropriate level of borrowing, things like what Western Governors University is doing right now with many of their students. We also think that it's important for campuses to look at environmental factors that support healthy decision making. And so if we think about financial wellness through more of a public health lens, there's the need to provide education support, but there's also the need to think about how policies and procedures drive student decision making. Some of the main areas that I think we really look at in this area are related to student payments. And that can be things like how we structure our payment plans, what fees are associated with our payment plans, and also how we ask students to pay based on when they register for courses. And so an example I would give there is if a student is being dropped from courses 48 hours after registering for non-payment, that may be difficult for them to close that gap over that period of time. Another thing that we like to look at is collections processes. And one of the things that we know is that the college journey is no longer linear and that many of our students start and stop out of their college experience. And part of the biggest barrier that we've seen to re-enrollment is past due balances and those being sent to collections. And so how we engage with a student when they owe a campus money can have a huge impact in terms of how likely that student is to re-enroll on the campus. The final real policy or procedure that we look at is the marketing and the utilization of debt products on campus. And as many on this webinar know, we've been through many iterations of regulations around debt products on college campuses. We don't necessarily view debt products as bad, and we think that there's some healthy debt products that can be used to help finance education, but also to build credit for students. That being said, knowing what is happening in terms of your campus banking agreements, any other agreements that your institution may have with financial institutions, but also what the community financial services landscape looks like is important in terms of our environmental health of students. To Casey's point about payday lenders, knowing where payday lenders may be in relation to campus, how frequent your students' utilization of those can be, can really help to inform how you provide support services to students on your campus. In the same vein, we also want to explore ways to get students enrolled in safe and legitimate financial services products. And so what we know from a financial behavior side is one of the most telling indicators of positive financial behavior is to have a bank account. And so for many of our students that are still unbanked, one of the first things that we can do to help break that cycle of some of the payday lending and higher risk borrowing is to get that student banked, both with a checking and a savings account to begin to build some emergency savings, but also to be able to avoid check cashing locations and other high fee products that may inhibit their ability to be financially successful. Finally, some of the data here can really help to inform back to some of the predictive analytics conversations how we view student retention. And so one example that I would pull out for our campuses on the webinar is that very often utilization of a credit card for tuition payments can be viewed as a financial vehicle of last resort for students. And so Sure, there are certainly some families or individuals that may pay for tuition on credit card to get a certain amount of reward points or to attempt to finance a vacation in the future. But more often than not, when a student is utilizing a credit card to pay tuition, it's because they don't have access to the liquid cash to pay that balance. The unfortunate reality of that is that credit limits are normally somewhat stagnant, and that is not a dependable vehicle that we can utilize semester after semester to pay tuition. And so if you're seeing students that are paying with credit cards, that can be an indicator of potential financial fragility that may be worth investigating and providing some targeted support services. The same can be said for payment plans. As a student is on a payment plan, providing interventions, in particular financial coaching, or the ability to help support the student in developing a cash flow plan to make sure that they meet those payments can be helpful. And we've seen campuses go as far as potentially waiving the fee that goes with the payment plan if a student can submit a written cash flow plan to help the institution understand how they plan to make those payments, which also has the added benefit of helping the student to develop a financial plan for the semester. So those are a few ways that we think that campuses can help to navigate that paying for college conversation and really provide the appropriate financial information and the appropriate environment for students to make healthy financial decisions.
Thanks, Brian. So the final topic area we want to address are questions around student perceptions of institutional support. These are questions asking where we ask the student to think about their institution and address things like, does my institution have the support services I need? And things like, do they understand my financial situation? We think that student perceptions about how the college understands their financial situation can either contribute to a sense of belonging on the campus, that they're in an ecosystem that understands who they are. But also we think that it also just provides a vehicle for them to get support and utilize support services when needed if they believe that their institution understands what they're going through. One of the first kind of series of questions we ask in this topic area, we ask for each of the items in the graph that you're looking at, what extent does the student agree or disagree that their institution makes the items more affordable? So to varying degrees, many respondents reported that their school makes tuition more affordable, 52%. Many believe that they make transportation more affordable, 43%, and required class supplies with 42%. Fewer respondents thought that their school made food and housing more affordable. That was 31% and 22% respectively. And this the housing was driven kind of by the community college participation in the survey, though, where when there is not residence hall on campuses, the answer to the question, does your institution make housing more affordable, is a little bit more nebulous. I just wanted to point that out. But one common thing that we've heard from students in the past and showed up in the survey is that textbooks are very expensive and sometimes rarely used. 50%, half of respondents in the survey, either disagreed or strongly disagreed that their school makes textbooks more affordable. In our focus groups that we've conducted over the years, this is something that pops up all the time. A student might say, this is a $300 book and we used it for 1 week. Doesn't my school understand what that means to me, what that $300 means to me? And we think that's really, an important thing that could happen to students when they realize that their school may not understand where they are financially. And to that point, we ask students to answer whether they believe their school is aware of the financial challenges that they face. So 40% either agreed or strongly agreed that their school is aware of their financial challenges, but 30% disagreed or strongly disagreed. And that 30% is really where we think some good work can be done to inform more people on schools, or maybe it's just a matter of messaging or marketing support services that can really maybe move the needle on the percentages of students who answer disagree or strongly disagree with this question. We also asked whether the student believes the faculty at the school understands their financial situation. So almost a third of respondents, 30%, disagreed or strongly disagreed that their school's faculty understand their financial situation. And as we mentioned before, faculty interaction with students is the greatest on campus. And we think that the commonly used example of the student who's head down sleeping in class, there may be more context behind that. It may not be a laziness issue. It may be that that student is working, that they're supporting family. There could be far more complicated reasons to that head down. Right?
So I think this is a very important, not that the others are not important, this is a very important section for campuses to think through, because as Casey mentioned, we've seen for a long time that sense of belonging and a student's indication that they feel that they belong on campus is positively linked to retention. As cost of college has increased, we've seen that the cost sense of belonging has become an increasingly important part of that overall sense of belonging for our students. And I mean that in two ways. One is, does the institution support me in terms of my financial well-being? And then secondarily, do I feel as if I'm able to participate and fit in from a financial aspect with my peers on campus? But we want to focus for the purpose of this conversation on the institutional side. One of the things in many campuses on this webinar, maybe in this boat, we've seen a large rise in campuses and states, for that matter, that have engaged in affordability initiatives on their campus. And really what we've seen out of many of these affordability initiatives are tuition freezes or potentially a small decrease in funding for our students. As we've navigated those challenges related to affordability, I think as administrators, we see those as very large wins, because when we think through what goes into an affordability initiative or a decrease in tuition or even a tuition freeze, we know that that's a pretty monumentous occasion, especially given declining state support, increased pension obligations, increased deferred maintenance obligations. All of those pieces drive, what is a rising cost structure within our institutions. And so to be able to hold tuition constant or even decrease it is incredibly positive. However, that may come off as insensitive to some of our students who are facing daily cash flow challenges. And so while we may tout this through press releases and say that we've done a great job of maintaining affordability on campus, they may still be looking at a $10,000 or $15,000 unmet need gap and thinking through, I don't know how to close this gap. This is not affordable to me. And so I think there's some broader messaging conversations that need to be had there. I think that, as part of those holistic affordability conversations, we really need to think through how, as campuses, we provide intentional programs and discussions related to reducing the supplemental costs of education. And so depending on your campus environment, this may look different. For many of our community colleges, especially in Texas, your textbooks may actually cost more than your credit hours do. And in that case, we may be looking at decreasing our textbook costs. For some of our non-residential regional access institutions, transportation may be one of the biggest barriers where students are unable to get to campus, and because of the lack of reliable public transit, we may have issues, and we may need to think about innovative partnerships such as dedicated bus lines or Uber partnerships that we've seen on some of our campuses to help students to navigate those transportation barriers. We also may look at our housing costs and think through, many of our campuses, housing is an auxiliary unit, and is the true intention of housing to be auxiliary and revenue producing and subsidizing of other parts of campuses, or is there a broader institutional mission to try to reduce the cost of attendance? Those are all difficult internal conversations to have, but relevant conversations in terms of student perceptions and institutional support. One of the things that we've seen is that as campuses offer emergency aid programs to students, we've seen the impact on retention in terms of that aid helping that student to stay in school. But just as much as that aid helps the student to navigate the financial challenge that's in front of them, we've also seen, and anecdotally more so through the comments than through actual data, we've seen that those students feel a greater sense of belonging and connection to the campus, and using some of their words, they feel as if someone cares about them and their success on campus. And I think that's something, that sense of belonging and that sense of fit is something that we can't underestimate in terms of an externality that comes with programs like our emergency aid programs. I think it's also important that we think about how we create that sense of belonging from a socioeconomic status perspective, and that really crosses into our student affairs and residence life programs for our residential campuses, but also crosses into how we message some of our tuition and fee structures to our students as well. And having that lens as we think about these conversations to make sure that it's approachable for all socioeconomic status is important as we work through some of those conversations. I would say finally, one of the things that we want to do, and this comes back to an earlier point, is think through how we intentionally train faculty and staff about those financial realities that we discussed earlier. One of the things that we've seen is that we want to try to make sure that every individual on campus is an owner of financial wellness. We talk often about when campuses create financial wellness initiatives, we want to have one office that is the home for that initiative, but we don't want that office to own the initiative. We want that ownership to be across campus, and that's owned by the Bursar's office, by student affairs, by academic affairs, by the financial aid office, and everybody in between. When we think about that, really what we're looking at is how do we create a culture of empathy within our staff and faculty to, as Casey mentioned, try to see beyond the surface level presenting of a student who's asking for an increase in financial aid for the second time, or a student who's coming to you and saying we can't meet our payment plan obligations, and try to dig down 2 or 3 layers to figure out what is driving those decisions and discussions. And if we're able to get there, we can then potentially be able to navigate some of those broader financial challenges with greater efficiency and support services on our campuses. But really, we want to make sure that we're having those conversations and that the student, when they approach with a financial concern, feels as if that concern is validated and as if that there is some sense of commitment from the institution to help them attempt to find a solution to that challenge, knowing full well that we won't be able to support all of those challenges. Again, I think the student perceptions are always a difficult one, and I think no matter what, we're never going to get to 100% satisfaction with some of these measures, but there's very real value in understanding that students' perceptions are often their reality, and the more that we can do to address those perceptions, the better off we can be in terms of creating a sense of belonging for our students. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the future plans for the Student Financial Wellness Survey. We're really excited to move forward with our next implementation here in fall of 2008, and we will also do one in fall of 2009. As we look at this, as we mentioned in the front end, participation is free for the individual campuses, and campuses get institutional level reports that focus on how not only their students have responded, but how that compares to their peer institutions that are also in the sample. Our deadline for participation this year is August 15th of 2018. And as we look through that, we really try on the Trellis end to do as much as possible to reduce the burden of implementation on the campus. And so primarily we ask for your guidance in navigating any appropriate institutional processes for research, but then also providing the data sample. And really we, from there, are able to do a lot of the administration on your behalf. Through that process. As we move through the summer and into the fall, we will be releasing additional analysis on the data, including taking a look at data aversion amongst respondents and seeing how that ties to some of the other questions that we've had. And so if there are things that pique campus's interest, we're always open to looking into different areas where there may be some value in further analysis. We have a very rich data set. We have more data than we have time to analyze, and so we're looking to prioritize what some of those questions may be that we try to answer to add the most value to the field, but also to the campuses that have participated. Additionally, we'll be analyzing the data set in more detail with educational records, and so many of our students in this sample have consented to having their educational records matched to their survey responses, and we think that this is going to be a very, very powerful opportunity to begin to tie the financial challenges and experiences that our students have to their academic progress and success, which is literature that we think will be very impactful for the field as we try to prove some of the things that we anecdotally know both on campus and as well as from student responses through that educational data match. Finally, we wanted to thank you again for joining us here today to learn about the Student Financial Wellness Survey, but we also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming research that we have from the Trellis side that will be coming out over the next few months. Our research team has been incredibly busy working on some great research to put out there to help inform the field, really with the lens of trying to understand how finances interplay with the student's ability to be successful and graduate from college. And so upcoming, we have our State of Student Aid report, which looks at really student aid across Texas and the key topics and trends in Texas higher education, including trends in the various financial aid programs at the federal and state level. We also have our financial security study, which is a longitudinal study of undergraduates that we did over the course of really an academic year, where we interviewed students on a monthly basis to better understand how their financial challenges were impacting their daily life, their academic progress, as well as their desires for long-term educational attainment. And we really see a deep and rich qualitative data set that can complement some of the quantitative data that we have in the Student Financial Wellness Survey around basic needs and financial stability. And so we're excited to be able to marry those two in conversation and help to provide some of the stories to back up the data points that you saw on the webinar today. We're working with Pew on a research project to better understand the repayment pathways that student borrowers take, with a recognition that many borrowers do not go through a traditional 120 payment repayment cycle. And so as we look at this, we're really beginning to see some trends for borrowers in terms of how they interact with the repayment system, which we think will have some strong implications as we discuss various policy initiatives related to student loan repayment at the federal level, but also can help to inform campus practice as we start to think about different metrics for institutional accountability as it relates to student loans. And finally, we have a study coming out that will look at Parent Plus borrowing. And so, we're increasingly becoming interested, as are many in the field, in understanding the Plus student loan market and the process that students and families go through to navigate the Plus borrowing experience. What we're really looking at here is looking at those who have borrowed Parent Plus loans and understanding those intergenerational conversations between parents and students. And so things like, where does the expectation for repayment lie? How did they decide to borrow a Parent Plus loans? What were the expectations when they took it out? Did they have a clear understanding of the obligations that they were entering into? Again, this is something that we think will have very strong implications, not only at the federal policy level, but also help to inform how we provide education and target our parent borrowers as they engage with the Plus Loan program at the campus level as well.
Yeah.
So just about the survey, we're providing a lot of good evidence, and I think it's real important to get that clear-eyed view of the status of student financial wellness on your campus. Some of this may be shocking, some may be bleak, but really this information can be used to better improve your retention and graduation metrics. Also, to the extent that a lot of the people who may be in more difficult situations are adult learners, many of these adult learners also have children. So think about the intergenerational impact that you can make if you have a positive experience with that adult learner. So we have a lot of good research. We're going to see what kind of questions we have, but a good way of keeping up to date on what research we have is to follow us on Twitter. Do we know what question?
Yeah, there's been one question about, and please go ahead and type your questions into the question box now, and we're happy to answer any of them. But the first question came from Mary, and it was about, are we going to post this presentation? Yes, we are. We'll send a link to everyone who is on the attendee list, and then we're also going to post it on our website, I believe. And so be on the lookout on that. Also follow us on Twitter and at Trellis Research, and we'll let you know right away when we post that. The next question, this says, hello.
So the question is I think driven by those who have participated in other instruments related to financial wellness. What are some of the differences between those surveys and the survey that we're conducting? I think there are some similarities across the two services. We use some common scales, such as the Lusardi scale and other scales, to try to get at a certain baseline level of understanding in student finances. But I would also say that the Trellis survey tends to be more comprehensive in terms of the individual institution's understanding of its student body. And so we dive deeper into things like basic needs security and the understanding of some of the financial stability aspects of our student body. We also dive deeper into the student perceptions of institutional support, as well as their desire to utilize various support services on a campus environment. And so from our perspective, we see the Trellis instrument as being more of a campus climate survey, primarily, and a research instrument secondary, as opposed to a research instrument on the primary side. And in that discussion, again, it really is more driven by how do we get that holistic, actionable information to the campus. And given that breadth of questions that we're able to ask, it also gives us a broader opportunity to try to explore some of the connectivity between these various topics that may be present on an individual campus. And so, again, we see it as a little bit more holistic than some of the other instruments that are out there. But certainly, we're of the opinion that the more information that is out there on this topic, the better for the field. And so we're excited to see more and more campuses evaluating this. And we're certainly more than happy to talk to any campuses about the differences if you've administered another survey on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah. Got that one, Brian?
So there is, we had a question about if there's any cost to administer the survey. There is no cost to administer the survey for our campuses. I say nothing's ever free because there is a small amount of staff time that goes into helping us to get it set up and to pull the data sample that we need to administer the survey, but no direct cost to the institution. The data results will be out, we'll be able to get those to campuses in spring of 2019, is that correct?
Yeah, it's about 4 months after the close of the survey that will get you your reports on your data. Any other questions?
We also welcome any questions that you may have via email. We know we've had one or two about questions about sound going in and out, and so we will post the recording as Casey mentioned. But if there are any portions of the presentation that you missed or would like us to expand upon, please feel free to email us. We're more than happy to talk further about that. And our email addresses are there, and you'll also get a follow-up email after this webinar as well.
Great.
And just finally, you're the ones that can make a real difference in the lives of these students, and we hope that we can assist you to, in that important endeavor. Thank you for participating in the webinar, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.